Welcome to this video. In this presentation, we're thrilled to have Haley Hoffman, Optilogic Solution Design Engineer, who will provide valuable insights on how to work with the China Exit Risk Strategy, a global distribution and sourcing database template. This powerful tool is designed to help you optimize your supply chain and minimize disruptions and can be found in the resource library. In particular, Haley will walk us through how to use the database in Cosmic Frog, providing practical tips and advice to help you streamline your operations and stay ahead of the competition. So sit back, relax, and let's dive right into the world of global distribution and sourcing with Haley.
There's a bottleneck at the Chinese suppliers, and we need to determine if we should shift the supply base to LATAM and/or EMEA. Different questions we need to answer include: how do we adjust and respond to the supplier bottleneck? What if capacity drops at the Chinese suppliers for something like COVID restrictions, port congestion, factory shutdowns? And what if our Chinese suppliers go offline entirely? How does the supply base shift if we bring EMEA and LATAM suppliers online? And what are the financial, service, and risk trade-offs? We need to answer all of these questions before we decide, should we get out of China? In the model, we have suppliers in orange over in China. We have potential suppliers in Europe and potential suppliers in South America and Mexico. Production occurs at 2 plants, one in Mexico, one in the USA, and distribution takes place from 7 DCs out to 1,300 customers in the US. This is our baseline global network today. You see suppliers in China moving to the port, flowing into North America. This is the baseline we will use to ask and answer our what-if questions about shifting supply base. Next, we look at the data that powers this model. We have our list of 63 global suppliers in Brazil, China, Germany, and Mexico. And we look at the procurement policies, which suppliers can supply which products to which facilities. To make it easier, we'll filter in on raw material 1, where we can see the cost comparison. The supplier in Europe is going to be most expensive, followed by China and LATAM. This will be important in powering the decisions surrounding the trade-offs of cost, service, and risk. A helpful tip here: if you hover over the column header, you can see the description for what data should be entered into that column. In this case, unit cost. Now we navigate over to scenarios where we can ask and answer our what-if business questions. Questions we are interested in are: what if our Chinese suppliers' capacity reduces by 30%, 50%, 70%, or if China goes offline entirely? We can ask these questions by setting up scenarios and scenario items to accomplish those actions. In this case, when China is reduced to go entirely offline, we exclude all of the Chinese suppliers from the model. Another helpful option while you build scenarios is the scenario grid, where you can dynamically build your scenarios. After setting up our scenarios, we can take advantage of hyperscale capability, run everything in parallel on a resource size that you get to choose. We're using network optimization today, but the data schema is unified, so you can run your discrete event simulation as well as your intelligent greenfield. We kick off the scenarios here. You can see as they run in parallel, taking advantage of that hyperscale parallel solve. We get our answers in about 30 seconds, and now we get to move on to the analysis. Now we can answer our supply base shifting questions. We start again with the baseline here, showing our existing as-is business, 100% of supply coming from China. Next, we can see the answers to our scenarios, like if China reduces capacity by 30%. We see now a mix of sourcing from the South American suppliers in Brazil and in Mexico, and our existing Chinese suppliers. What if China goes offline completely? This is one of the questions that we were concerned about at the start, and we see another shift in the global supply base footprint. We have a mix of suppliers now from LATAM, Brazil and Mexico, and EMEA, based in Germany. As we zoom in here, we see how the supply footprint has shifted from China over to LATAM and EMEA. One other option is if we set a constraint in the model to exclude the LATAM suppliers and shift supply between China and EMEA. This is the result that you see here, one of the different options that we could use going forward. We've answered what happens if we shift the supply base from a sourcing, distribution, and product flow perspective, but now we need to dive into the financials, service, and the risk trade-offs. Here we dive into the trade-off between financials, service, and risk. We start with a detailed look at the costs, specifically transportation, production, and sourcing costs across each of the scenarios. We can do a quick comparison using the native dashboards within Cosmic Frog. Next up is to dive into the service level KPI, which in this case is demand fulfillment. Service level is equal across all of the scenarios. If we only look at the cost-service trade-off, then we would be finished with our analysis and we would have our answer. However, there's a third aspect we need to consider here in the bottom right corner, and that is risk. Here we look at the continental supply, which is the supply base by continent for each scenario. In yellow, we see how much of the supply comes from LATAM, in green from EMEA, and blue from China. Our model has a maximum constraint that up to 40% of supply can come from LATAM. For example, in the China reduced by 30% scenario, we see 40% of supply comes from LATAM, while the remaining 60% comes from China. In the four scenarios where China is reduced or offline entirely, and we are supplying from LATAM in yellow, we see a cost benefit. Hovering over the bars here, you can see that these are lower cost scenarios, and some of these scenarios are actually cheaper than the baseline of using 100% China. So a no-brainer would be to go with the LATAM sourcing, and if we did not have a risk engine, we would stop here. We found the cost-optimized lowest solution, and we'd be good to go. However, that risk engine adds a very important new dimension of supply chain analysis. We see the cost benefit of bringing on our LATAM suppliers, but we also see there are additional risks. This may go against our own preconceptions or our own intuitions about risk, and that's where the risk engine comes in, because it enables us to explore additional lower risk scenarios and understand the cost impacts. Next, we dive into the supply risk summary to determine why the OptiRisk score is higher when we move to LATAM. We see that for our LATAM suppliers, in red and pink, that economic resiliency risk and political risk are higher than their European counterparts. We can answer the question exactly as to why did the risk not reduce when we moved to LATAM. And while we want to leave China because we encountered that supplier bottleneck, we need to be aware that moving to LATAM comes with risks related to economic resiliency and political stability. Without the risk engine, we would have made the decision based on cost optimization alone. This decision likely would hurt the company in the future, as the risk in LATAM played out to some degree. This is further evidence that given today's rapidly changing global complexity, you can no longer design your supply chain based on cost alone.